I want to point something out. I just took a picture just now of Juliana up here with Julia because if you remember, and this probably goes back 5 or 6 years, Terrell did a series of teaching on women, and where we saw in Corinth that women were actively involved in the assembly. And we talked as a church through what that would look like. And that it might not be real popular, but if God was using the women at the Corinth church, then surely he intended to use women now. And one of the things that was brought up over and over again as we talked about this was the idea that we have to model for our kids. And you see guys all the time, leading singing, and they bring a little boy up here, doing a prayer, they bring a little boy up here, and we model, hey, this is how you do this. Mama got up here with her Bible, and Juliana grabbed her papers up and came up here with her. It's modeling. And I'm so proud of our church because it's not been easy. And I know that some of y'all have had family members that have said, what are you doing over there? And you can't just sit down and say, well, there's everything in the Bible about it. It doesn't always work that way. So I know it's not always been comfortable for everybody. But I appreciate the willingness for us to look at the Bible and say, if the Bible says this, then we're not going to be held to tradition. We're going to do what the Bible says. And I think we're going to see that pay off in the lives of our daughters. So I just want to say, I think that was a neat moment. I just think that was a cool moment. So today, before we start, there's something we want to talk about. There's a woman who we hired to do some painting in the children's area of the church. Her name's Camilla. She has a sign shop over here across from English Sew and Back. And you may have heard her daughter, I found out after Bible class, I had the age wrong. She was, I guess, 23, but her daughter Michelle was killed in a four-wheeler accident a week ago. So I had texted her about something with the painting, and she said, oh, I'm so sorry. I still want to do it. My whole world's turned upside down. It's just an absolute tragedy. And there is a GoFundMe for the funeral expenses that they weren't quite able to cover. So you don't have to, but we're going to send the link out in case somebody wants to. We'll send the link out later this afternoon to this GoFundMe. I would just ask that if you do, she won't know who you are probably, unless you know her personally, but if you do send some money to help, just put in the notes. There's usually a comment place. Hey, I go to church at Reedland and we're looking forward to you, doing the painting. We just wanted to help out, just so she knows it comes from the church, because we just want to care about her. She did the mural at Hearth and Home on the side, and she did the one at Breathe the Farmer. She's very talented, and we just want to let her know that we care in a really, really difficult time for her family. So we're going to send that link out. That's what that'll be about if you choose to give. Also, I want to remind you that 2 weeks from today, on the 24th, we're going to have our big flip party where we move all the furniture back. We are going to assemble some teams for that, so it can be very targeted. So we will be contacting some people, but do plan if you're able to stay and help that day, because we'll have some things we'll have people do even if you're not on a team. Also, after service today, I'm asking any parents of small kids who are able to stick around for just a few minutes, about 5 minutes after service ends. I'm going to grab some bubbles and sidewalk chalk and things like that. We're going to go right out here in the back with the camera, and we're going to take some pictures that we're going to put on the wall in the kids area. So we're going to try and take some real nice pictures of kids having fun that we can put up there. So if you're able to stay for a few minutes after and you have small kids up to about 3rd grade, 4th grade, please do, and we'll try and get some pictures. Can't promise every picture will make it on the wall, but we're gonna try and get some good ones up there. If you lived in the ancient Roman world in or around 8 AD or after that, you would have likely at least heard of Ovid's Metamorphoses. Ovid's Metamorphoses was kind of like the Harry Potter of the ancient world. It was the best-selling book of a generation or two. It's a Latin narrative poem. It's 11,995 lines long. I don't know if there's anybody here who's read the whole thing, but it'll take you a while. It chronicles the history of the world from the time of creation up until the reign of Julius Caesar. Ovid was already one of the most popular poets in the Roman Empire before Metamorphoses came out, but this was his magnus opus. This was his greatest work, and it rocketed him to fame. It was immediately popular and influential and stayed influential for hundreds of years, still is very influential today. Hidden among the 15 books that made up Metamorphosis was a brief story about a married couple named Bacchus and Philemon, who lived in an area of what we would today call southern Turkey, in a mountainous area outside of a village in a very modest, rustic cottage just outside of town. One day in the story, two men were passing through the town, and they were knocking door to door looking for a place to stay. They were turned away, rejected, rebuffed by every door they went to. Nobody would give them a place to stay for the night until they stumbled upon this very modest cottage of this very, very poor couple, Bacchus and Philemon. Bacchus and Philemon didn't have much to share, but they welcomed them in and shared what little they had. Bacchus served them food and wine, but she noticed that as often as she filled their glasses with wine, the pitcher seemed to stay full. Eventually, they realized that the strangers they entertained were the Greek gods Zeus and Hermes. The next morning, as the story goes, the two gods escorted the couple to the top of the mountain to watch as they flooded and destroyed the town full of people who had rejected them. Then they transformed their cottage into an ornate temple and tasked them with the guardianship of it. Now, if you move less than 200 miles to the east, and I'm going to show you this on the map, from the town where they were, it's very small, but the town where they were was Tyana. If you move to the east, you go to a little town called Lystra. Now, Lystra was a military outpost for the Romans. They took it over in 6 BC. They used it as a military outpost to conquer the tribes of people in the mountains to the west. To the east. I got my directions backwards. They wanted to conquer the people to the east. So these soldiers were coming from Rome in order to suppress the exact people in the exact place that Ovid had written about in his story. So, if you were a young Roman officer coming from Rome in 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 AD, and you're being sent to an unfamiliar and unruly area, and the top-selling book in all of Rome that Rome is buzzing about happens to contain a short story about somebody subduing the unruly people in the exact area that you are going to, you think you might have a copy? You think you might bring it with you? You think you might share it with all of the soldiers that you're commanding and all of the people in the town? You bet you would. And so, it's pretty safe to say, there's very little doubt, that everyone in the town of Lystra was very familiar with the story of Bacchus and Philemon. Now fast forward 40 years. In AD 48, Paul and Barnabas arrive, guess where? In the city of Lystra, where all of these young Roman soldiers now have grown to be old Roman soldiers, sharing the tale from Metamorphosis, 200 miles away in the mountains, of these Greek gods coming to visit. And as Paul and Barnabas walk through the city, they encounter a lame man sitting by the city gate. Acts 14, if you want to turn there, and we'll be in Acts 14. We'll look at a couple different passages, but we'll mainly camp out here today, starting in verse 8. In Lystra, there sat a man who was lame. He had been that way from birth, and he had never walked. He listened to Paul as he was speaking. Paul looked directly at him, saw that he had the faith to be healed, and he called out, "Stand up on your feet." At that, the man jumped up and began to walk. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down in human form!" Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, who was at the temple just outside the city, brought bulls and wreaths to the city gate because he and the crowd wanted to offer sacrifices to them. I'm sure you probably read this story before. I've read it before. But it makes so much more sense now. These people in this real place, at a real time, thought that the gods of the Greek pantheon had come down to visit them. This is a real place. In the late 19th century, there were excavations that found evidence of a massive temple of Zeus, just outside the city, with inscriptions to Zeus and Hermes that go back to at least the 3rd century, but possibly much earlier. So imagine if you were the priest in this temple of Zeus, right? And from birth, you were set on your mother's knee. You're maybe 40 or 50 years old. So from your entire life, this story has been in existence, and your mother would sit you down on her knee as a child and say, "Now be kind to strangers, little one. Once upon a time, 2 strangers wandered through our countryside and performed miracles. They turned out to be the gods Zeus and Hermes. And they were gracious and kind and rewarded the ones who were gracious and kind to them. But to those who rejected them, they brought their wrath." And you grow up with that. And now one day, you're ministering in the temple of Zeus, offering sacrifices, and you hear news that 2 wandering strangers have come into town and performed a miracle. A bona fide, verified, indisputable miracle. A person that you have known your entire life to have never walked is jumping around and dancing. And so you rush out of the temple thinking, this is the same gods that came before. These are the ones that visited Bacchus and Philomene. We have to be gracious and kind to them. We need to offer sacrifices to them. So you bring your calves and your goats and your cows and whatever else and your garlands and wreaths, and you bring them out before Paul and Silas, and you start shouting for everybody to offer sacrifices because the gods have come into town just like your mother always told you they would. What would you do? You'd probably do the same thing. So they rush to Paul and Barnabas, they proclaim them as the gods, they begin to lay the garlands at their feet and worship them. It just kind of makes sense. But Paul and Barnabas, they're not having any of it. So back into Acts 14. But when the apostles, Paul and Barnabas, heard of this, they tore their clothes and rushed into the crowd shouting, "Friends, why are you doing this? We too are only human like you. We are bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them. In the past, he let all nations go their own way. Yet he has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their season. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy." Even with these words, they had difficulty keeping the crowd from sacrificing to them. Now, I had a friend have something similar to this happen to him many years ago. His name is Ken, and he was on a mission trip in Haiti. And he liked to do simple magic tricks for kids. He liked to pull a quarter out of their ear. Or you've probably seen the one where there's nothing in your hand and then a little red foam ball appears. Or you pull the handkerchief out of your sleeve and it never stops. You know, the kind of tricks you can go buy for a few dollars in a magic kit for a kid. But Ken loved these sleight of hand, and he was pretty decent at them. And when he went on the trip, he's got a crowd of kids around him. He starts pulling quarters out of the ear, and they're all amazed, and it's a lot of fun, and they're all laughing and having a great time right up until the witch doctor showed up. Because some of the adults got pretty freaked out, and they ran to get the witch doctor. Now you got to understand that witch doctors in Haiti exert a humongous amount of influence. They extort people with their magic, often even poisoning people so that the community believes that they're dead so that they can offer a remedy which will bring them back to life, which is where we get the idea of a zombie from, and now they're the witch doctor's slave. They practice extortion to keep their income flowing in the community in line. They're kind of like a mix between David Copperfield and a mob boss with a pharmacist mixed in. And this witch doctor didn't want any new magician creeping in on his territory. So suddenly it got very serious. Ken had to show everyone exactly how he did every trick, that there was no magic involved. It really wasn't even until later that night when he sat down with the local missionary and explained what happened that he realized that he had himself been in tremendous physical danger. Because if his explanations had not satisfied the witch doctor, he likely would have been dragged off and beaten or killed or poisoned. This is actually very similar to what happens next to Paul and Barnabas. Paul and Barnabas refuse the sacrifices. They say, hey, we're just humans. The power is not with us. But guess what? There's also no power in Zeus or Hermes. There's no power in your worthless temple or your worthless idol. There is a power, but it comes from the true God of heaven and earth, not from us and not from what you have going here. It doesn't come from wood and stone. It doesn't come from gold and silver. It comes from the God of heaven and earth. They basically explain the power's not in them, but it's not in the witch doctor either. It's the right thing to do. Refuse glory, reflect glory. That's what invisible leaders do. Refuse glory, reflect glory. But it's also offensive. It is. It's very offensive. Suddenly those who were proclaiming them to be gods feel foolish, silly, embarrassed. Suddenly those who are zealous followers of Zeus see Paul and Barnabas as blasphemers. Suddenly those who have worshipped their gods, Zeus, their whole life, giving monetarily and materially to these gods, they feel stupid, like they've had the wool pulled over their eyes. And suddenly the priest of Zeus and the entire temple establishment are accused of being a fraud. And remember that in the pagan world, the temple was oftentimes the center of the local economy. So if that temple goes away, the whole economic system has to be realigned. Acts 14. Let me pause for a minute and say this. We should probably also realize that as Paul and Barnabas are busy offending these people by telling them the truth, they're actually already on the run for their lives. Because just days before, less than 20 miles to the north, this happened. So this is back at the beginning of chapter 14. At Iconium, Paul and Barnabas went as usual to the Jewish synagogue. They spoke so effectively that a great number of Jews and Greeks believed. But the Jews who refused to believe stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. So Paul and Barnabas spent considerable time there speaking boldly for the Lord, who confirmed the message of his grace by enabling them to perform signs and wonders. The people of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews, others with the apostles. There was a plot afoot among both the Gentiles and the Jews, together with their leaders, to mistreat them and stone them. But they found out about it, and they fled to the Lycaonian cities of Lystra and Derbe. Think about this. Just days before, maybe just a day before, Paul is preaching, and the unbelieving Jews there plan to kill him. Perhaps because they knew him before as a champion for Judaism, who persecuted Christians, and now he's a turncoat. He's a blasphemer. Now he's advocating that they follow a rabbi who the priests rejected and the Romans executed as a criminal. But whatever the reason, they want him dead. And so Paul finds out and he runs for his life. But probably not the smartest move he ever made. Paul only runs to a city that is about a 7 or 8 hour walk away. People go back and forth between these two cities all the time. There is no way that the news of the Zeus and Hermes debacle at Lystra does not get back up the road to those angry Jews in Iconium. So from the moment that this happens, Paul's probably thinking, hey, Barnabas, let's just lay low. Let's just kind of chill. Oh, well, God, we got to heal this guy. We'll heal this guy. Oh, no. Stop. Don't call us. We're not gods. The moment this happens, Paul's got to know he's on the clock. He has to know this news is going to get back to the other city. And in as little as 24 hours, he may have people there hunting him down. They won't travel at night. It's an 8-hour journey, so he's probably got the rest of the day and into the day tomorrow before they get there. But they will come. And they will bring stones. So maybe, just maybe, if you're Paul, a large crowd of zealous followers who think you are God in the flesh might be zealous enough to protect you from the people that want to kill you. Think it's a possibility that Paul thought about that? Maybe he would just benefit himself by letting them stay confused a little bit longer until he could get out of Dodge. but he doesn't do it. You know, as I was thinking about this situation, I was trying to think of a modern or somewhat modern parallel, and I kept coming back to Abraham Lincoln over and over again. Because 161 years ago, on January 1st of 1863, Abraham Lincoln issued a document to the warring northern and southern factions of the Union, which he hoped to preserve. It said this: I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, by virtue of the power vested in me as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States in a time of actual armed rebellion against the authority and government of the United States, and as is fit and necessary a war measure for suppressing said rebellion, I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of states are and henceforward shall be free. Such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States. And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of God Almighty. Those are the words in part of the Emancipation Proclamation, one of the most famous documents ever issued in American history. Now, Lincoln knew that as a war strategy, it had to be done. It would demoralize the South. It would undercut their economy. It would increase the Union soldier reserves. It also appeared from his earlier writings that he believed it had to be done for the moral integrity of the nation. However, he was under tremendous pressure not to do it. Most politicians thought it was illegal. His opponents, and even much of the northern press, thought his order to do this was no less than an act of being a tyrant, that it made him a tyrant, that he thought himself a dictator who could do whatever he wanted. Some of his closest advisors had no hope for an integrated society. Many feared it would only divide the nation further. Very few thought the proclamation made under military law as a war tactic would survive the legal challenges it would face in a post-war world. Public opinion was against it. His own Secretary of State, William Seward, told him it would lead to anarchy. The Confederates, of course, were outraged, putting a target on Lincoln that would ultimately cost him his life. You may remember that when John Wilkes Booth assassinated Lincoln, he yelled the Latin phrase, sic semper tyrannius, which is Latin for thus always to tyrants. It was a statement that Lincoln was a tyrant who thought he could dictate and control whatever he wanted. I think of Lincoln as he weighed the cost to himself, which he was aware of, against the preservation of the Union. The value of his own life against the lives of 3.5 million enslaved people. It would have been awfully tempting to be cautious. Listen to your advisors. Play it safe for a little bit. Not make the hard decision that would forever seal your fate as an intolerable tyrant to your very dangerous and very numerous enemies. We know for a fact that Lincoln was racked with doubts and fears, that he was in anguish, that he was feeling the same things that others were expressing. He was isolated. He was depressed beyond belief. He wavered on the decision as he labored over it. But I wonder if, as he labored over it, he could picture the scene for millions of enslaved people, such as what Booker T. Washington would later describe. Booker T. Washington lived out this scene as a 9-year-old slave on the plantation of James Burroughs in southwest Virginia. And as he recalled the moment, he said this: "As the great day drew nearer, there was more singing in the slave quarters than usual. It was bolder, had more ring, and lasted longer into the night. Most of the verses were plantation songs. Some had references to freedom. Some man who seemed to be a stranger, a United States officer, I presumed, made a little speech and then read a rather long paper, the Emancipation Proclamation. After the reading, we were told that we were all free and we could go when and where we pleased. My mother, who was standing by my side, leaned over and kissed her children, while tears of joy ran down her cheeks. She explained to us what it all meant, that this was the day for which she had been so long praying, but fearing she would never live to see. You know, there are times in life when we have to decide something at great personal cost to ourselves. And for many people in history, that decision has cost them their very life. I have no doubt that Paul chose to honor God by setting the people straight and staying there and preaching the good news to these young believers in full anticipation of what would come next, in full realization that he was putting his neck on the chopping block, that his enemies were coming to try to take his life. And that's exactly what they would do. Acts 14, verse 19. Then some Jews from Antioch and Iconium won the crowd over. They stoned Paul. They dragged him outside the city, thinking he was dead. But after the disciples had gathered around him, he got up and went back into the city. They show up. They find those who are embarrassed and still zealous for their false gods. It doesn't take much to convince them that Paul is a fraud, an imposter, and a troublemaker. They seize on all of those negative emotions and they whip the crowd into a frenzy. And the crowd comes and seizes the man who days before had amazed them to the point they were ready to worship him. And they stone him, drag him out of the city, and leave him for dead. You know, Paul had to make a hard decision to refuse their affections and to stand his ground in order to nurture the young converts there. For Lincoln, one young boy he affected was Booker T. Washington, who would grow up to be one of the greatest orators, authors, and advocates for education of the black population that our country has ever known. For Paul, one young boy he affected was Timothy. Timothy lived in that city. He was the son of a Greek man and a Jewish woman. And he believed Paul. And he would have been there that day when Paul was dragged outside of the city and stoned. He watched Paul stand his ground. And he watched God raise Paul back up when everyone thought he was dead and bring him back into that city to keep teaching the believers there. He saw a radical Christian man refuse glory, stand unafraid of an armed mob. Timothy would grow up to be Paul's right-hand man, his spiritual son, a missionary, a preacher, and the recipient of 2 letters of the New Testament which bear his name. The moral? Invisible leaders make the hard choice. God's glory over their own benefit. God's glory over their own safety. God's vision over their own comfort. God's will over their own wants. God is raising us up to put him first, even above our own comfort, our own security, and our own safety. Today is Witness Sunday. Jared's going to grab a microphone, and I'll have this other one here. We're going to take around. I'm going to give you an opportunity to reflect on what we've talked about. In America, we don't like to talk about hard things like putting God before our own safety. It's just not a comfortable topic. But there's a lot of ways that this can apply. And I want you to think about what God has been doing in your life, what God has done in your life. Has God ever called you out of your own comfort? Have you ever admired somebody who did that? Have you ever said, you know, I saw somebody who did that. I saw somebody who risked themselves. I'm going to give you an example, and he doesn't know I'm going to say it. But a couple of years ago, you might remember that the Mathenis, when they were still in West Africa, that Anne was bitten by a bat. And she couldn't get the rabies treatment over there. And there was a matter of days until the medicine could be administered. And Nathan Anderson said, my visa's active. Send me. I'll go right now. I think Blair and Rennell were instrumental in helping get the medicine, and he got on a plane, 20 hours, red-eye flight, putting all of his own comfort aside to bring that medicine to a little girl who we all love. And he didn't have to make that choice. Now, we're not going to put him in the Hall of Fame for it. but it was pretty cool. Maybe you've seen somebody do something like that. Maybe God's called you to do something. Let's take a few moments and let's share what God is doing among us.